Okay, we're moving into section 2, and as I've said before, we're going to take a lot of the basics and kind of expand on them as we go through this semester. And so this is a little chapter kind of going back through the list of things that we consider this is what living things have. So congratulations, you've won a lifetime supply of life. Now, some of this we can't be absolutely sure is necessary for life off planet. Is that it's the very first thing that's up here is definitely true for life on Earth, but there's potentially other ways to do it. So you're dealing with a chemistry that's driven primarily by proteins, enzymes, a whole bunch of other things that we use proteins for. We just talked about that in the first section. And we use a particular type of nucleic acid in order to pass the information for those proteins from cell to cell, from parent to offspring. Just we have genetic systems that allow us to take all of the information we need to do what we need to do and pass it along. Now, there's also built into this epigenetic systems, where we have the codes for all this stuff, but we also have an activation and deactivation system for I guess for every code. But there's a way to shut codes down essentially permanently, or leave them shut down until you turn them on, and you turn them on more or less permanently in a lot of systems. Involved in this is the ability to pass these codes on to offspring, whatever the offspring are. Remember, the definitions are a little confusing here. Asexual reproduction is reproduction where the offspring are genetic copies of the original. Is that they may not be physical copies because they may not be using the same active genes as the parent individual. So the same way that our cells all are genetic copies of one another, they're not all doing the same things. But asexual reproduction has nothing to do with how many parents you have, and nothing to do with finding a mate or not finding a mate. Asexual reproduction is a particular type of copying. You take your genetics, you make copies of it, that intact copy goes on to the offspring. Well, just a reminder. Asexual and sexual, I'm going to write this down here and then come back to it. Like a lot of stuff, the advantage of one is reflected in the disadvantage of the other. The advantage of asexual reproduction, it's actually reproduction. This isn't really reproduction. We call it that, but it's a lie. Because reproduction is making a copy. In the process of sexual reproduction doesn't make copies. This does. And if the whole idea is perpetuating yourself, ad infinitum, this is it. This is the advantage here. You can actually make copies. The downside is that your copies are all, if conditions don't change, if they're well suited to the conditions, then they're great. But if the conditions change and it disadvantages one of them, it pretty much disadvantages all of them because they all have the same coding potential. They all have the same response potential. They all are making the same proteins. Unless the codes have mutated. And then the odds of making a protein that's useful in the new conditions is pretty lousy. But again, for people that haven't had this before, I hope you're writing this stuff down. I know people coming from the first semester have had this as kind of a reminder, so I'm kind of zipping through and not writing a lot of this stuff down. That's a warning. Doesn't mean I'm not going to ask you questions about it. Asexual reproducers get around the disadvantage by cranking out huge numbers of offspring. This gives them two compensations for we all have the same weakness problem. The first one is it tends to spread the offspring out. Asexual reproducers are small, bacteria, protozoans, that sort of thing. So their environments are microenvironments. Doesn't take much to spread beyond a microenvironment. And if the conditions change here and you've spread offspring out to here, then they may not be caught in the same issue as the original group. It also, mutations are not common. Most mutations don't do anything in terms of function. They don't change the function of the possessor of the mutations. But if they do change the function, they're much more likely to screw up the function of these proteins than to produce something that's advantageous. The odds of producing advantageous mutations that are advantageous for a particular change in conditions is quite the long shot. These guys crank out trillions and trillions of offspring, very typically. Long shots work to their advantage. It's like buying a million lottery tickets, is that there's a good chance you got a winner in there. That's also why they're small. In terms of environmental resources, if you're small, there's enough environmental resources to crank out a million offspring. Not so much if you were our size. A lot of the asexual reproducers are bacteria. Bacteria cheat. Bacteria will package small loops of DNA with useful genes on them, very often genes with a useful mutation on them, and they will share them. So when they do get an advantageous change in their DNA, it isn't just those subsequent offspring that are going to benefit. They can spread it around inside a group, sometimes even things that are not related to them. That's a problem where if we dose you with an antibiotic that you don't need, we sort through your internal bacterial population for mutations that are resistant to that antibiotic. They can package that mutated gene onto a little copy plasmid and share it with new guys who maybe later come in and can hurt you. That's why we don't want to give you an antibiotic for a virus. It doesn't hurt the virus, but it may set you up down the road for sharing antibiotic resistance we pushed into your own particular microbiome, your own buddy bacteria. Okay. Sexual reproduction. Offspring are a mixture of genes from two sources. Doesn't mean two individuals. It can mean two individuals, but it means two different sources. We tend to think sexual male and female. That's by far the most common approach to sexual reproduction, those two genders. But all a gender is, and I'll put this down here. When sexual reproduction happens, you have two contributors, maybe from the same organism, like you have in flowers or you have in flatworms, or you have it in a whole bunch of animals and plants and funguses. Well, those two contributors, what are they? Are they doing the same thing? With funguses, they are. They're trading nuclei. They're trading haploid nuclei and producing one set of chromosomes of the two, one mix over here, combining, producing two sets of chromosomes. And now this cell is genetically unique compared to the two contributors. But in a flower, sperm from pollen, egg cell in the base of the flower, from the same flower, mix over here, mix over there, different mix than the overall flower had. So the advantage of sexual reproduction is it produces a variation in offspring, different mixes of genes, because they all have two complete sets of genes that are not always the same alleles. And so they can mix and get different allele combinations. That gives you more potential to deal with changes in conditions because you have variation across your population. The downside is you can't make copies. So, but larger organisms, they don't need to crank out huge numbers of offspring to have the needed variety to deal with changes in conditions. And genders can be, you tend to think male and female, you go, oh, genders come in some sort of pairing. Well, no, there's always pairing going on, but say there's some funguses that, depending on the conditions tend to determine, there's, in one slime mold, there's 38 different roles that could be played by the partners, depending on conditions. The conditions change how the genders play out. Yeah, it's only, contribution from two sources, but it's still, it changes depending on other things. Typically, to get from one reproductive cycle in life to the next one, to the offspring getting to that, they need to get bigger and they need to develop. They need to get to the point where they're ready to do their version of reproduction. Whether it's a seed, getting up to the point where it can make flowers, whether it's an animal, getting up to the point where it can reproduce sexually, produce sperm or eggs and contribute, or sperm and eggs and contribute them. You get growth and development. It may be very simple. Bacteria divide. They're half the size they started as. They need to grow, and then they need to set up some things in order to reproduce again. So growth and development is all connected to this part of what we consider to be part of life. Still on this list. Whoops. Well, sorry, I'm not entirely sure how this is. Oh, there we go. I'm running out of the plastic that I write on, and this one is doing an odd thing. It is stuck in a way that when it's normally not stuck. Okay, the next thing that's going to be on the list is what we were just talking about, is that life uses and changes energy. We are what are considered to be dynamic individuals, dynamic units, and we are highly organized. We take in energy and we change it. Tracking energy in a system is tracking the metabolism. Very often you're sending it through steps, you're following it down a metabolic pathway. But all chemistry involves exchanges and changes and ups and downs of energy, right? Dynamic equilibrium and all that. And that's what you find in living things, is that there's now I'm going to throw a term in here that isn't really living things. We have in our brains what's called consciousness. We're kind of aware of ourselves as individuals. We're aware of our potential futures and the futures of other people, and we understand what's going on in other people's brains. How does that happen? Well, there's a lot of people that study the brains that are sure that all they really have to do is figure out the little bits and pieces that contribute to that process, and that'll be enough for them to understand where consciousness comes from. Other people go, it's too complicated and it's too transitory and ephemeral, is that it isn't something that you can pin down to just a metabolic pathway in a process. It's an emergent property. It's a property where no matter how much you dig into it, you're never going to be able to construct it or possibly even duplicate it. And of course, it's a big fight whether these things really exist or not. Is that if we know how all the little bits and pieces work, aren't we obviously going to know how the whole thing works? It's a question. I mean, we already have this issue with computers where, you know, can't tell you how many people have looked over my shoulder and looked at what my computer's doing and said, but it can't do that. There it is, doing it. Is it the recordings that I make this way? Is that I went to the Apple store and said, why does my microphone that I used for half of the semester last semester not work anymore? And they looked at it and they went, you can't use a microphone like this. It doesn't work. The system isn't set up for input. It's only set up for output, which is wonderful. That explains why it doesn't work now. Why did it work for a month? We don't know. It's not supposed to do that. It was an emergent property. They never did figure out what it was. And you know, whatever emergent property it was, it went away. Life on Earth, the organized base unit is a cell. Things can be unicellular, the whole organism is just one cell. They can be multicellular, where we're an aggregate of a bunch of cells doing different things. There's a gray area in between of unicellular colonial. There are some organisms where the organisms can exist as single cells in the environment. That is not the way they normally are found. That's not the way they are normally happy. They normally aggregate, and then different cells in the aggregate do different jobs. So they're single cell, they're unicellular, acting like multicellular. So that's the gray area between unicellular and multicellular existence. We are not islands. We interact with our environment. We take things in. We build things with parts that we get. We wind up with leftovers we can't use that are potentially dangerous. We need to get rid of those. We need to take in information and react to the information. So some level of senses is necessary. And the very simple levels, mostly chemical senses, but they work for an awful lot of small organisms. I mentioned before, sometimes the environment that we're dealing with are microenvironments. There's a new theory of cancer that is saying that one of the and we'll talk about this later, one of the contributing factors to cells that normally would just be normal dividing cells is the microenvironment that kind of keeps them from going out of control. Something changes in their microenvironment that influences the potential cancer cells to become cancerous. We think of environments as ecosystems. Everything around a living thing, the other living things, the physical environment is an ecosystem, and it's definable however you want to define it. Is that our bodies are ecosystems. My kidney is an ecosystem. This room is an ecosystem. This campus is an ecosystem. Is it? No. The Adirondacks is an ecosystem. And how tightly or broadly you look varies. Ecology is a lot about defining parameters, where maybe we're going to look at a population. What is that? Well, in our defined area, it's all the members of the same species. Maybe we're going to look at the communities. That's, in our defined area, interactive populations. You never can look at every single population because you don't even know what all the populations are. So you tend to define, what are the, like if say you were studying coyotes in New York State, your population would be the coyotes, but the community would involve possible prey animals, possible human interaction, possible pathogens. Is that the community winds up being things that all have an influence on coyotes. And then the ecosystem would be the physical parameters. How are they dealing with the cold and snow? What do they do in this, for water? Is that how do they adapt to warm versus cold? Those are all ecosystem questions that apply to New York. Might not apply strongly in other places. And the role of a species in an ecosystem is a niche or a niche, depending on how French you want to be. Another definable term is that you can say top predator or surface spreading plants. One of the things that annoys me when they show dinosaurs is the dinosaurs all look like they're running around in a parking lot, is that we don't know what the surface spreading plants were during the era of the dinosaurs. Grass had not evolved yet, but it's too available a niche to not have been occupied by something that probably was outcompeted by the grasses eventually. All of the things on the list are things that individuals or small populations, you can find them doing. This only happens to populations over time. Groups change so that the average member of the group becomes different than the average member of the group down the road, down time-wise. Evolution is change of populations over time, which is why the chicken egg thing is a silly question. There was never one chicken or one egg. There was a population. The same way where if I want to breed a new breed of chickens, I'm not going to be happy having just one. Is I'm going to breed a breeding population of chickens that then dependably gives me that same sort of variety when I keep breeding within them. Is that's artificial selection, but it produces the same sort of process as evolution, whereas nature selects the survivors and the reproducers. In natural evolution, artificial humans decide. One thing to throw on the end here, we'll talk about these a few times as we go through. Viruses don't fit everything on the list, and so some biologists do not consider them to be alive. They are typically not cellular. They often have protein casings rather than membranes, and when they do have membranes, they've generally stolen it from the host cell rather than generated it themselves. A virus that is not inside a host cell doesn't really have any metabolic activity, is that it is cued to attach and react to potential host cells, but that doesn't happen until it hits, like the spike protein on coronavirus has to hit the ACE receptor on cells in your body in order to set off the system that gets the viruses inside. Now, some people say, well, also they don't reproduce without that host cell, but there's a lot of parasites where that's basically true. You wouldn't consider parasites to not be alive. But A virus is released fully formed, it doesn't grow and develop. So its reproduction is different. They are asexual reproducers. Again, right now we're seeing variants, and one of the things that's generating the variants is there are some people that are catching coronavirus and are not tossing, they're not dying, but they are holding on to it and being positive for a long period of time, which means their immune system is trying to control it over months and sorting through variants that maybe are better at evading immune response. And then when those spread, we now have a variant that maybe isn't as easy to control immunologically. So there's a bunch of things that viruses do that don't put them on the list, but they definitely do evolve, they definitely do reproduce. They just aren't a few of these things. Okay, as I said, this was just a quick reminder of the basic list of life, and now we get into things, we've already gotten into metabolism at a much higher level than we did in the first semester. We're going to get into some of this other stuff at a much higher level in the first semester.